Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. I've been making care videos here on YouTube now and plant breakdowns for over 4 years, and I realised recently that I have never done a deep dive on arguably one of my favourite plants, the Peperomia Hope. And if you watch my other videos, you will know just how much I love this plant. It has been a firm favourite in my collection for as long as I can remember. However, it has not always been a straightforward journey with this plant. I have struggled with so many things over the years with the Peperomia Hope. I've struggled with propagating it. I tried loads of different ways and I was like, why isn't it working? I've struggled with very leggy growth on this plant, very small leaves, lots and lots of things that have made me go away, do lots of trial and error, lots of research, and finally, I feel in a pretty good place to be able to talk to you about this plant and how to keep it happy. So that is what we're going to be doing today. But first, if you're new here, hi, my name's Claire and this is Yoli. I make videos all about houseplant care, sharing tips and tricks I've learnt over the years to help keep your plants happy and healthy. And yeah, grab a pen and paper, grab a cup of something, and I hope you enjoy it and I hope you find it useful. Let's get into it. So the Peperomia Hope is actually a hybrid peperomia. It's a cross between the Depeana and Quadrifolia. And I've said it before, but hybrid plants, so basically plants that have two different species of plants as parent plants, are often much more resilient to things like disease, pests, and lots of common issues that you can encounter with purebred plants. That's just from my personal experience. I believe it's because they have obviously a more diverse gene pool. So this is actually a very, very hardy peperomia. It's one that is incredibly drought tolerant. It can, in theory, go very long periods of time without water. Also, just by looking at it and by feeling its leaves, it is a semi-succulent, meaning that it really stores a lot of moisture in its leaves. I've said it before, but appearance-wise, to me, it always kind of reminds me of a Hoya because it's very robust and kind of sturdy as a plant, but also very delicate and pretty. But so the first thing to think about with this plant is light. And so for me, when I first started growing the Peperomia Hope, I was living back at my mum's house and my mum had this beautiful, beautiful conservatory room that although it was north facing, it just had fantastic all day round light. And my Peperomia Hope was hanging right in the middle of that room. So I really didn't encounter issues at all with my Peperomia Hope there. I was just like, it grows happily and it's fine. And it was when I moved here that all of the issues started happening. So the first thing I looked at was light and I was like, okay, so it was getting bright and direct light all day round in its old environment. And here, although areas of this room are fairly bright, it was getting nowhere near the intensity of the light that it was getting before. So that was the first thing that I had to think about, and I went on a little bit of a deep dive with. And what I found is that a lot of the people that were encountering, as I've already said, the much smaller growth than they would like, and the growth that's kind of more spaced out on the vine and not as kind of condensed and full, that was happening. Primary reason because of lack of light and because the plant wasn't getting exactly what it needed in order to grow happily and healthily. So I've tried a few different things. I've tried growing this plant under grow lights. I've tried, again, pushing it right up against the window spot that I've got here. Although this room doesn't have a glass roof, it's obviously still got lovely big windows. And I have never been able to get it to achieve quite the level of growth that I was achieving in the conservatory. So I do just think very bright and very long hours of light are something that are very important for this plant. When I had it under grow lights, that's the only time that I really started to see its leaves start to actually properly size up again. And I believe that that's because I was running my grow lights for about 16 hours a day, which might not be the most economical thing in the world, but it was keeping this plant incredibly happy. Currently, the position I'm growing this plant in is through in the window next door, and to be honest, it's not getting the optimum light conditions that it needs. And if you look at some of the growth towards the bottom, you can see just there, for example, it has got quite stretched again. So as soon as I'm able to, I'm gonna get it back, hopefully in this lovely bright window here, and just up its light a little bit more. But the one thing that I'm much more aware of now that, to be honest, I didn't really bother doing before is I make sure to keep its leaves really, really clean, because this is something that is so often overlooked when we've got indoor plants. But any buildup of dust, dirt, whatever it is, even if you've got the cleanest home in the world, it still happens. Any buildup of dust and dirt essentially acts as like a shield on your plant's leaves, preventing them from absorbing all of the light they need, and therefore meaning they can't photosynthesize as effectively, and new growth will often be the thing that suffers. So if you're trying to keep your plant lovely and full and healthy, what I typically do is I'll get mine into the shower, just because obviously if I was to go around with a duster on every single leaf, it would take me forever. But when the time comes when this plant is ready for a drink, probably around about every month and a half, 2 months, I'll get it into the shower and I will just give it a thorough spray down. This has also meant that on the whole, I have been able to prevent pests on this plant, because strangely enough, although like looking at it, you might not think it's one that encounters a lot of common household pests, I have had thrips on this plant before, which is not one that I would have expected. Looking at it, I would have thought it's more susceptible to mealybugs, which, touch wood, I have never encountered. But yeah, like I say, if you get into the habit of regularly showering down your plant, then you will also be able to hopefully get rid of anything nasty that might be lurking there. Pest checking is obviously important as well, but that's just how I've managed to kind of regulate things for this plant. And again, if you do see the growth of your plant start to become quite sparse and leggy, I really encourage you to give the plant a prune back, because that is something that I always used to be so nervous about doing, because I was like, no, I don't want to lose loads of the length in the plant. But every time you chop a plant, it basically encourages your plant further up the stem to push out new growth. And if you've then adapted your environment and you're giving the plant better conditions, chances are the growth that regrows is going to be much fuller and much healthier. So anytime at all I notice this happening, I will just take the scissors and give it a chop. I'm going to do that later in the video so that I can show you how I propagate the plant as well. But I really would encourage you with this plant to do it. And the thing that I've done as well over my time of owning the Peperomia Hope is, as I've chopped and propagated the plant, and as I've acquired more sections of the plant, because I was very kindly given a section of this plant recently, I have just added it to the top of the pot, and I'm getting it fuller and fuller and fuller each time I do it. So essentially it's just working to encourage the growth that you want to see, and it's not as difficult as it sounds. I know I'm probably like sounding like I'm massively overcomplicating things, but once you've got a stable environment for this plant and you occasionally chop and propagate it and just fill it out, you really don't have to do a lot to keep this plant happy. Like, I pay very little attention to this one compared to lots of the other plants in my space. I will say, however, if I have the opportunity to grow this plant in full sun at some point, I will absolutely take it. I know some people say you've got to be very, very careful because the plant can scorch and burn. And of course, that is truth in that. If you move it from like a medium light spot to all of a sudden being in direct sunshine, then yes, the plant can burn. But if you make it a gradual transition and kind of acclimate the plant slowly, I believe this one would do phenomenally in higher levels of light. So yeah, just think about the hours of light and the intensity of light, and if possible, up it for this plant. And that is probably one of the biggest hurdles you're going to have to jump over, in my opinion. But they're coming on to watering for this plant. As I said at the beginning of this video, this one is a semi-succulent. It's very waxy, very robust. And because it is so drought tolerant, a lot of the time I think people do tend to leave it a little bit too long. And this is a difficult balance to strike, because I bang on all the time about the fact that underwatering is always better than overwatering, and you've got to be so careful not to cause root rot, particularly in a plant like this. And there is a lot of truth in that. You do have to be very vigilant about monitoring the soil and making sure you're not giving your plant water at a time that it doesn't need it. But the other thing I have found is that when this plant does completely dry out, if it's putting out any new growth at that point, again, that new growth seems to just completely stunt and stop. And then you are again left with very, very, very small leaves. So I will typically just go around, stick my finger down into the soil. Obviously you can use a moisture meter for this as well if you don't trust your own judgment, or if you just want to be a little bit more specific. But typically now I've got a pretty good sense of just feeling this plant and getting used to what it likes. I would say I let the soil dry out to About 90%. I never let it, or I try not to ever let it get to bone dry, but there's also not a lot of moisture left in the soil. That is, for me, what I find works really, really well with this plant in my environment. Again, the leaves are a pretty good sign. Like if they're starting to curl and you haven't watered your plant in a while, then chances are your plant is massively dehydrated. As I say, it's typically not an issue with this plant. It will usually bounce back quite well if it is very dehydrated, but you will likely impact that new growth. So yeah, again, it's just striking the right balance. When my one's leaves feel quite thin and flat as opposed to kind of thick and juicy, that is when I usually go in for a water. So in fact, I don't know, I might need to put some clips in actually, but if I show you them on camera now, as I say, I'll put some close-ups on the screen. But this is the time where I personally would go in and water my plants. And I've said it so many times before, but I would never recommend you schedule your watering in any way. I would always go off what the soil feels. And obviously this does change throughout the year. Like obviously at the moment here in the UK, we're in winter. So the plant is drying out at a very different rate to how it would when it's getting lots more light and warmer temperatures in summer. So yeah, it is all about monitoring your plant and only watering it when it's actually ready for a drink. If you don't know, don't just guess. And as I always say, if you're in any doubt, leave it another day or two, go away, come back, check again. And when you are confident that the plant is ready for a drink, then go ahead and water it again, because otherwise it can lead to things like root rot and fungal issues. And with this plant, things like stem rot and all the things that you don't want to be dealing with. Just on the note of overwatering as well, I say overwatering just because it can be a little bit confusing because you hear the word overwatering and you think it means just giving your plant too much water. It essentially just means giving your plant water when it's not ready for a drink. But making sure your plant's got good drainage as well. I have got mine always in its nursery pot that I lift out of the ceramic pot that I've got it in so that I can take it out and let it thoroughly drain through, let go of any of that excess water that it doesn't need after I water it, and then pop it back into its pretty pot. But then again, when it comes to fertilising your plant, I personally believe that if your plant is in an active state of growth, then you should continue to fertilise it, give it nutrients all year round. I didn't always think this way. I used to completely stop watering over the winter months, for example. I would only, fertilising, I would only fertilise during the growing season. And since I have started doing things this way, i.e. fertilising my plants whenever they're in an active state of growth, I have noticed the growth of my plants just explode and keep going, a lot of them all year round. A lot of my plants haven't gone into periods of dormancy. As I say though, if your plants do go dormant at certain times of the year, that's fine as well, but just cut out the fertiliser for that period, because all you're going to be doing is giving them nutrients that they can't process and they don't need, and that can actually lead to issues such as fertiliser burn and other horrible things that, again, you really don't want to be dealing with. So again, like I've just said, it all comes down to monitoring your plant. And again, when it comes to nutrients for this plant, the other thing to think about is what you're growing it in, the substrate that you're choosing. And I've seen people grow this plant in a few different ways actually. And I know I often say, for me, semi-hydroponic growing is fantastic for peperomia. I do it for so many of my other peperomia and they are really happy. I found that this one doesn't like semi-hydro quite so much. So what I use for this one is a combination of base mix, which typically I get mine from Soil Ninja, and it typically tends to be soil, pumice, perlite, coconut core, worm castings. Did I say perlite? I think I did. And with that, I just mix through some orchid bark to make it nice and chunky. This is an epiphytic plant as well, so in nature, typically it won't grow right out of the ground. It will grow attached to other rocks, other plants, and kind of trail down like that. And for that reason, adding in lots of things like orchid bark for just some chunkiness just helps to replicate how it would grow in its natural habitat. And I find that mix works really, really well. The other good thing about adding in nice chunky elements like bark is that it really helps with drainage. So you don't want to choose something for this plant that is just extremely moisture retaining and doesn't let your plant let go of that water, because as I say, because it is a semi-succulent, it will be much more prone to issues such as root rot and stuff like that if it can't properly drain. So yeah, that is what I found works really well. Obviously have a play about yourself, see what works best for you. Although there are substrates with certain types of plants that I'd be like, only use this for that, or like, that one's amazing in this. This is one that I have experimented with a little bit, and I haven't, like, nothing has been awful that I've tried. So yeah, I would just advise something chunky and something well draining. And then when it comes to temperature for this plant, this is one that it does pretty well in a variety of temperatures, but ideally I would recommend about 23 degrees to 30 degrees Celsius. And this one is actually commonly known, Peperomia as a genus is commonly known as the radiator plant, purely for the fact that typically you can kind of grow it in pretty much any conditions. You can even put it right up against your radiator and it'll be fine. Obviously with this plant, if we want to grow it lovely and full and healthy, as we've established, you need to look at other conditions, but it is one that does much better in my experience in higher temperatures. So wherever I can, I will up the temperature. Like, I try on the whole not to let my flats drop that much below 20 degrees Celsius anyway, just because I do have so many tropical plants and I'm like, I want them all to stay as happy and healthy as I possibly can. But if you don't want to run the heating all the time or anything like that, I know it's very, very costly, or can be, you can look into things like heat mats or little plug-in radiators that you can group plants around. I often find, and again, in fact, the old environment that I was talking to you about when I was growing this plant originally, the conservatory I was growing it in really was quite cold, and I used to bring little plug-in heaters because they were so much more efficient and cheaper to run, like little oil radiators, and I would put bowls of water on top of them to help increase the humidity in the room, as well as running humidifiers. That was just a much more cost-effective way of doing things, and it kept my plants happy, including this one. But then yeah, when it comes to humidity, this is a plant that doesn't need massive levels of humidity. Like, it's not going to do awfully if the humidity drops slightly lower, but again, if you want it to look lovely and conditioned and just more vibrant and healthy, personally, I would say up the humidity, like up it to as high as you can. So many tropical plants, in fact, I can't think of any plants, bar maybe like one or two that I've got in this room, that would care if I upped the humidity to like 100%. They would all be thriving and happy, because a lot of the time that does just replicate, again, the environment in which they naturally grow. So this one, I would say kind of anything above about 50% would be fine. If it drops lower, it's not the end of the world, but if I'm recommending the best for this plant, I would say 50% or higher. And then finally, propagation with this plant. This is a peperomia that I have tried propagating in pretty much every way possible over the years. I have tried so many things and I have failed at so many things. So like I said earlier, if you do notice that your plant is getting a little bit leggy, I do encourage you to prune it. And I'm just gonna take some scissors here and I'm just gonna chop this part back. And then the best way that I have found is by taking the leaves of this plant. So if you just break the leaf off like that and then chop it in half. So you've got two sections like that now. And then just pot them down into, you can either do a sphagnum moss kind of propagation box type thing, or what I'm gonna do is just put them straight down. I don't know why my camera's not focusing very well today, but I'm just gonna put them straight down into soil like that and kind of half submerge them. What I would do then is just cover this in cling film. Obviously make sure that the soil is lightly damp. Cover this in cling film, leave it somewhere very warm, very light, and although it's not the quickest peperomia in the world to propagate, in the next couple of months or so you should start to see some little baby leaves appearing and roots forming down into the soil, and that is my most effective way. I have tried water propagation, I've tried propagation from the actual stems. Honestly, like it is a tricky one to propagate, but this is, I would say, a pretty surefire way. I've tried it in so many ways, and this way, touch wood, has never failed for me. So yeah, if you've got any other questions about this plant, please do comment them down below and I'll do my best to get back to you and answer them. But yeah, in a nutshell, lots of light, long hours of light. Don't let the plant completely dry out, but also don't overwater it. So just a little bit of moisture left in the soil, lots of nutrients so long as the plant is still growing. Prune it back. Don't be afraid to prune the plant back. It will often help to just encourage better growth as the plant fills out. And yeah, that's about it really. But I hope you enjoyed this video and I really hope you found it useful. And if you did, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.
Stay sexy, plant lovers.